Hello again, viewers. Welcome again to the DLife.in channel. I'm Shashikant Iyengar, the host today. I'm a low-carb nutrition coach on the DLife panel and also freelance as a low-carb nutrition coach. I'm also co-founder of Reclaim Health India, a low-carb nutrition coaching venture. I'm also the first SMHP accredited low-carb coach in India and the only one with more than 10 certifications on this subject. And for those watching this program, this is not a medical or nutrition advice. People are requested to take the guidance of the doctor and a low-carb nutritionist for any changes. So DLife is a community platform for low-carbers. It's a platform for those suffering from diabetes, obesity, PCOS, hypertension, and other metabolic syndrome. DLife India also has around 250 success stories, and they have more than 1,200 low-carb Indian recipes, especially tailor-made for India with quite a number of vegetarian dishes also. 2 years back, DLife.in also launched Diploma in Low-Carb Nutrition for those aspiring to start their own low-carb keto practice. And you can get more information in the DLife.in website. So DLife was developed by Mr. Anup Singh, who is an engineer from IIT, the premier institutes in India. And we are all there in Twitter, me and DLife. So any information you want, you can just ping us. So viewers, today we have a very, very special guest from US. We have Sam Apple. Sam, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Welcome to India virtually. And Sam is on the faculty of the MA in science writing and MA in writing programs at Johns Hopkins University. And Sam is the author of Ravenous, Otto, Warburg, the Nazis, and the Search for Cancer Diet Connection. Sorry. His work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Wired, the Los Angeles Times, the Financial Times Magazine, ESPN The Magazine, and the MIT Technology Review, among many, many other publications. He also has few other books which he has authored. And the most interesting one, which we'll discuss today, is the Ravenous. Sam, you launched this 1.5 years back or 2 years back?
It's almost 2 years. May 21.
May 21. Fine. So this was your introduction, which I gave. So, Sam, do you want to say something more about yourself?
Sure. Yes, my main job these days is teaching science writing and teaching writing at Johns Hopkins University. And I've been a science writer for about a decade. I started off in sort of general writing and nonfiction, and became more and more interested in science writing over the years, in part because I became interested in nutrition and trying to understand my own health. And as a journalist, I was really interested in a good story, and the story of how we got nutrition wrong, and how that led to tremendous health problems in the US and around the world, I think is one of the most remarkable stories I've ever come across. So I've been interested in it ever since.
I think that's very interesting. And what I find is many of us have learned or took keen interest in nutrition to correct our own health. Somewhere we have been affected by either obesity or diabetes or maybe any other part of metabolic syndrome, and then we somehow found a way and got more interest in nutrition. So again, appears that you are again one of them who has corrected not only his nutrition, but you have dug out a lot of information, which is very crucial and we'll discuss today. So what is this about Ravenous? So can you tell us about this book very briefly on the context? What is it? The name is very interesting. I find Ravenous, I find Otto, Warburg, I find the Nazis. So what is the connection?
Sure. So, I was interested in metabolic health more generally, and the connection between obesity and diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And then as I was reading about these topics, I learned that cancer is connected to this same group of diseases. They used to be called diseases of civilization, and now they're sometimes called diseases of the West, or industrial diseases. But these are diseases like diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and cancer that became more common in the 19th century, and then throughout, the 20th century, grew more and more common, and they tend to cluster together. And so I was really fascinated by cancer being a part of this topic, because I thought cancer was something separate that didn't belong with this other group of chronic illnesses. And when I began to research this, I discovered that one of the most critical discoveries was made by a scientist named Otto Warburg in 1923, 100 years ago. And, what he found is that the cancer cell takes up much more glucose than a normal cell, and that it metabolizes it in a very unusual way. That's why I got to the word ravenous, because these cancer cells appeared to be ravenous for glucose. They just take up more and more. And it was a very curious finding. And, we've been trying really to understand it for the next 100 years, and we're still trying to understand it. But to me, this is one really critical clue, because, I like to think of it as sort of two distinct phenomena. One is that we have something about the way we eat causes cancer. We know this because of what I said before, that it clusters together with all these other diseases, that obesity is now, pretty much the biggest risk factor for cancer. And then we know that the cancer cell eats in this unusual way, taking up a lot of glucose. So my book, Ravenous, in a very big way, is trying to see if there's a connection between what we put in our mouths and, how the cancer cell eats. And if there is a connection, what is it?
Very, very interesting. So who was this Otto Warburg?
So Warburg makes this discovery in 1923, and I could have focused on other scientists, but I focused on him in part because he was such a fascinating character, as at least to me. He grows up, his father, Emil Warburg, is a brilliant physicist, and he grows up in this house in the early 20th century and late 19th century, where all the greatest scientists of Germany, and really some of the greatest scientists in history, are coming in and out of his house because they're friends with his father, Einstein and Fritz Haber and Emil Fischer, and on, all these titans of science. Many of them, in the early 1900s, go on to win the Nobel Prize. And so Warburg grows up in this house, and he loves science. He's dedicated to science, and he really decides at a young age that he's going to be a great scientist. He's going to win a Nobel Prize. The only question is, what area he's going to study. He knows he's going to be great. He was an incredibly arrogant person. One of the many stories about him is that when he finally did win the Nobel Prize in 1931, his first response was, "It's about time." So he really deserved to win it multiple times. And when he won the Nobel Prize in 1931, it was actually not for his cancer research, but for his study of respiration, how a cell breathes. But in 1923, when he becomes really focused on cancer, he makes this discovery of how the cancer cell takes up extra glucose. And what's particularly interesting is that the cancer cell is not breaking that glucose down and burning it in the mitochondria, and what's sometimes called the engine of our cells. Instead, it's an unusual metabolism where cancer cells are using, what I call in the book, the backup engine, the generator. They're breaking the glucose down and then quickly turning it into lactic acid. And it's not a very efficient way to generate energy. It's actually what happens normally to a cell in desperation. If you're doing intense workout, you can't process fuel fast enough. You turn on this backup engine. But cancer cells, Warburg saw, they had enough oxygen. They weren't under stress in the way you would think. So why were they taking up all this glucose, and what was driving that process? So it became known as the Warburg effect, this idea that even though there's oxygen present, you're still processing it and still fermenting it. That's one of the striking things, is that it's really just fermentation. It's the same process that gives us beer and wine and cheese, and cancer cells were doing this. And, to this day, scientists are trying to figure out what advantage it gives the cancer cell. But I was even more interested in a different question, which is, how does that process start? Because, if we can figure out what flips on that process, then, we might have a path to cancer prevention.
Surprising. That means till today, we don't know why it happens.
Yeah. I mean, that in terms of what advantage it gives the cancer cell, there's a lot of disagreement. I think the leading theory is that, it used to be thought that extra glucose means extra fuel, but surprisingly, as I said, that this backup engine, this glycolysis, this Warburg effect is a less efficient way to make energy. So it seems that, what cancer cells are really getting out of it is building blocks. When they process glucose quickly, they can get a lot of the raw materials they need to make daughter cells. They've got to do a lot of work making lipids and DNA, and they get these building blocks from glucose molecules. I mean, they need some nitrogen as well from other sources, but the question, again, is why does this happen? Is it just an unlucky mutation and that gives the cancer cell the ability to take up glucose? Well, maybe, and if that's the case, then, maybe there's not a clear connection between what we eat and how a cancer cells eat. But I think there's a overwhelming amount of evidence that there is a connection, that something about what we eat causes this process to be more likely to turn on. And, a lot of people thought, and, I'm sure we'll talk about this more, that it was just glucose. You eat a lot of glucose and there's more glucose in the blood, and therefore the cells can take it up more. But that turned out to be, maybe in the vicinity of the truth, but not quite accurate enough. And the final piece of the puzzle, as I see it, was really understanding the relationship between glucose and the hormone insulin, and the hormone insulin functioning really as a growth promoter for cancer.
Very, very interesting. Now the next question is, what is the connection between Warburg and Nazis?
Yeah.
What exactly between Hitler? So that's what I've been reading in your book. What exactly is it?
Yeah. So, I mean, my book is, maybe, I don't know, 50% nutrition and then 50% Warburg story. So, I'm a journalist and kind of trained as a storyteller. So I was looking for, a story I could tell that would allow me to capture some of the history and how this all evolved. So Warburg is a famous scientist whose father was Jewish. He didn't really grow up thinking of himself as Jewish, but in Nazi Germany, all that mattered is if you had a parent or grandparent who was Jewish. So in 1933, when the Nazis come to power, Warburg is a famous scientist, but he also has Jewish heritage. So he's in a somewhat dangerous situation. And many of his colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes who were Jewish, they quickly got out of Germany. But Warburg, interestingly, decides to stay. And it's part, I mentioned before that he was extraordinarily arrogant. He couldn't imagine anybody telling him what to do or anybody kicking him out of his institute. So some of the most amazing stories are in the early 30s. These Nazis come to his institute and to harass him, and he shouts at them. He slams the door in their face. He says he's going to burn down his institute if they continue to bother him. So, it's very dangerous what he's doing because he's provoking. At one point, he goes to Max Planck, who is also, a family friend, and he says that he wants him to rewrite the rules of German science to protect Warburg specifically. He's literally wrote out what the Nazis should do to protect him. But, so for a while he survives. And part of it you have to understand is that Warburg thought that, like many Germans and many German Jews, they thought that Hitler would be a short-lived phenomenon. After a couple of years, it would go away and things would return to normal. So he stays in Germany and things get worse and worse. Eventually he can't get out anymore. And, in 1941, the war has started and Warburg looks to be in a very dangerous situation. It's really incredible. He's called into Nazi headquarters. He's given an eviction notice from his institute, and they sit him down and they tell him that he's going to be allowed to stay in Germany as long as he focuses on cancer. And this is another part of my book, which, is a really strange phenomenon that I came across, that the Nazis were fairly obsessed with cancer, and Hitler in particular. And it was partially because Hitler's mother had died of breast cancer and he had been by her side. And, historians have said that was his mother was the only person he was even capable of loving or relating to. But it's also partially, what I talked about before is cancer becoming more and more common. So, the Germans had been at the forefront of science in the 19th century, the leading scientific country in the world, and they were making so much progress against infectious diseases. But meanwhile, cancer was growing more and more common. They couldn't defeat it, and they were growing panicked about it. And so, they really, they were monsters in the sense of, wanting to murder, but they were also, sort of hypochondriacs and wanted to figure out, how to defeat this disease. So in the end, they had to choose between kind of their hatred of Jews and also homosexuals, because Warburg was, known to be gay, really, even though he wasn't public about it. And so they decide to protect Warburg, and, in the hope that he will cure cancer.
Very, very interesting. That means Hitler was afraid that cancer could be genetic and he could be afflicted, and a possible cure will actually come through Otto.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So very, 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 very interesting. So what happened ultimately? Was this cancer glucose theory generated during that time, or was it later on? How is it?
Yeah, well, in the post-war period, shortly after World War II, Warburg continues to make the argument that cancer is a metabolic disease, that this process he discovered, this Warburg effect, is the key to cancer. And there is, for a few decades in the 30s and 40s and even into the 50s, this was taken as a very serious idea. And there's a lot of research into what causes the process. I already said that I think insulin is a big part of it. Warburg was actually more interested. He was also interested in nutrition, but he thought the key to the process might be that the certain foods we eat have chemicals in them, and that the chemicals interfere with the respiration of the cell and force it, damage the respiration, damage the mitochondria, and force it to turn on the backup engine. So, he didn't know much about insulin at that time. And so that was one theory. There were other theories, but people were very interested in this question of how a cancer cell breathes, how a cancer cell takes up nutrients. And then it slowly, in the second part of the 20th century, it starts to fade away for a number of reasons. It didn't help that, excuse me, that Warburg himself, because he was so arrogant, people didn't like him very much. A lot of scientists were also suspicious of him because he survived in Nazi Germany. They thought, what did he do to survive? Did he make an agreement with the Nazis? So people didn't want anything to do with him. And he was making these extreme claims that he couldn't always support. And then, Warburg had said that the cancer cell doesn't use oxygen at all. And then some people were able to show that, some cancers continue to respire, continue to use oxygen. So people thought he had been discredited. And meanwhile, in the 1950s, of course, we learned the structure of DNA. And that sets off a process which leads to, in the 1970s, identifying the first genetic mutations that cause cancer. And when that happens, Warburg really gets left behind. I mean, I heard stories from scientists of, throwing out the Warburg manometers, these machines that measure respiration, taking the diagrams off the wall that show the metabolism of the cancer cell. Everything is now focused on mutations, genetic defects, and it's so extreme that, young scientists in the 70s and 80s haven't even heard of Otto Warburg. He disappears from the textbooks, even into, the 2000s. The leading cancer textbook doesn't mention Otto Warburg in the first edition. They come out with the hallmarks of cancer, this famous paper, and Warburg, metabolism isn't even mentioned in the first edition. So it just completely wiped out. And then, was rediscovered only in the late 1990s. And the last part of my book, I talk about how it was rediscovered and, what that's led to.
Very, very interesting. What could be the reason? I mean, why they disbelieved him and refused this theory? I mean, is there anything else which conflicts, in the sense when he shows that cancer cell takes up sugar. Do you think there is some industry behind that during that time, which seems to be very unlikely? Or maybe I don't know what could be the reason why this theory was rejected.
Yeah, it's very strange. I think one reason, I mentioned a little bit that Warburg himself didn't help things with his personality, but one part of it, I think, was that scientists get excited about one idea, becomes like a trend, and then everybody forgets about the previous idea. But I think a deeper problem was that metabolism, is naturally linked to diet. And as soon as cancer scientists start to think about diet, they become suspicious. That sounds like, oh, that's quackery. We don't know anything about diet. Diet's not related to cancer. So there's a very strong bias against diet, as I'm sure everybody in this community knows. And so that was part of it. And I think that, there was the goal, to the extent that Warburg and others had understood this process, the goal would be, can they find a drug that could interfere and, maybe restore the normal metabolism of the cell? Nobody had found that yet. And so it was sort of like, okay, let's move on to the new thing. And, there was a lot of money, a lot of excitement about, mutations. There was a lot of optimism. They thought in the 1970s, once they discovered these mutations, okay, now we know what we're going to do. We're going to figure out what each mutation is. We're going to invent a pill that's going to turn off that, mutation, turn off the signaling network, and we're going to cure cancer. And of course, that turned out not to be the case. But, there was reason for optimism in the 70s. Maybe what's unfortunate is that it's taken decades and decades and still ongoing for people to realize that it's not working.
Very, very interesting. I also read in your book that Hitler was also addicted to sugar.
Yeah, that's a strange piece of this whole story, and that's I'll just jump back because I actually didn't tell. What I find to be one of the most fascinating stories about Warburg is that. In 1941, when I mentioned he's called into Nazi headquarters, it turns out to be that the day that he's called in, June 21st, 1941, later that night, the Nazis launch operation. They launched this operation. They go into the former Soviet Union. It's Barbarossa, and they essentially risk the entire Nazi project to go into the Soviet Union. It ultimately leads to the downfall of Nazi Germany. But that very day, Otto Warburg is in Nazi headquarters. That night in Goebbels' diary, you see that that Hitler is talking about cancer right before this operation that, is really the biggest moment in Nazi history. So he was really obsessed with cancer, even throughout the war process. And it wasn't just Hitler, it was all the leading Nazis, Himmler in particular. And, so Hitler wanted to try to figure out, what was causing this. And he also, suspect at times he talked about diet, but, like many people, he thought that the best diet was the most vegetarian, he avoided meats. He thought that, the natural pure Aryan diet came from the earth. And meanwhile, he was consuming massive amounts of sugar. He was a sugar addict. I don't think that caused his behavior, may have caused some of his mood swings, but it's just, kind of an ironic, dark twist in history that Hitler was a sugar addict. He was addicted to other drugs as well. But he had an obsessive personality. And at the end, when he's dying in his bunker, I read one biography about him, said that he couldn't get his other drugs, that sugar was his last drug. And he was so sick at the end that, I think he would have died within weeks or months, even if, the Russians hadn't arrived. And, he couldn't even walk up, a small set of stairs at the end. He was really just incredibly sick.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting to know that we all knew that Hitler was a vegetarian. So now I think with your book, we also come to know that he was a sugar addict.
Yeah.
Very, 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 very interesting. So
The
what I want to see, few more things which you mentioned uh, about the PET scan. So for diagnosis of cancer. So please tell us something about it.
Yeah, the CAT scan is kind of an interesting story because I mentioned that, in the last part of the 20th century, the scientific world, the cancer scientific world, had forgotten about metabolism, had forgotten about this thing that Warburg discovered, that cancer cells take up extra glucose. But meanwhile, this new diagnostic scan comes out called the CAT scan, which basically, all it does is look at where in the body extra glucose is being taken up, and that's, that allows them to diagnose cancer. So it's this kind of great irony that, it's literally staring the cancer world in the face that there's something important going on here, that this is how we can diagnose cancer. And so, fortunately, in the late 1990s, maybe in part because of the CAT scan, it's just what they do is they make the glucose radioactive so you can trace it throughout the body, and then they see where the cancer is based on where the glucose is being taken up. So finally in the late 1990s, some really brilliant, innovative scientists go back to Warburg. They start to think about these things, and it's really because they're trained in this new genetic approach to cancer, and they're trying to understand which mutations are most important and what's driving the cancer cell. And they see that a lot of the mutations that seem to be fundamental to cancer turn out to be these enzymes that, related to these enzymes that actually control how a cell takes up glucose. And so it's sort of like a full circle. It takes them back. And then, one scientist in particular that I focus on the end of the book is Lewis Cantley. He's now at Harvard. And what he finds is that some of the most common mutations are specifically in this pathway known as the PI3K pathway, which is the pathway that responds to insulin and basically tells a cell to take up glucose. So that was kind of a way to piece all this together. Suddenly we find that 70 to 80% of cancers have a mutation in this pathway, this PI3K pathway, that is actually turned on by insulin. So then the question is, well, what if insulin is elevated all the time, is constantly activating this pathway? Would this give, microscopic cancer a growth advantage? Would it allow it to take off? And that's what it sort of put all this together. So the hypothesis, and I still use the word hypothesis because this is still we need more science. But the hypothesis is that you eat a Western diet, it's now a global diet that's full of carbohydrates and sugar in particular. When I say sugar, I mean sucrose. I mean not just glucose, but sucrose, the sweet white stuff, which seems to be uniquely good at causing insulin resistance and elevating insulin. And then you have a body that's full of insulin all the time. And insulin is a growth factor, it's a growth promoter. It's, if you want to prevent cancer, you certainly want to do everything you can, I think, to keep insulin at normal levels so you don't have 50 times normal flowing through your blood, giving these microscopic tumors a chance to take off, causing a cell to overconsume glucose and lead to reactions that actually make mutations more likely to happen. These reactive oxygen species are also caused by this sped up metabolism. So I don't think that you can never guarantee that you won't get cancer, but and sometimes it is bad luck. But when you look at what the world looked like in the the early 1800s, it's dramatically different from today. And even into the late 1800s and 1900s, you had scientists who were going to, or doctors who were going to different populations, and they were astonished because these populations didn't seem to have any cancer, or very little cancer. So something fundamental has changed. And I think the most fundamental thing is this insulin resistance, and that it used to be that very few people had it. Now almost all of us have it. And that puts us all at greater risk for cancer.
Very, very interesting. And so hence there's a strong link between even diabetes and cancer. There's a very strong link. The
Very
hyperinsulinism.
strong. But
hyperinsulinemia, hyperglycemia, there's a very strong elevated risk, and many people who are susceptible are going to get it. You also mentioned something about fructose. Yeah, no doubt we have been talking about sugar. Maybe we take sugar as a glucose thing, but then yes. So you see there is a link between everything, all three, glucose, fructose, and hyperinsulinemia.
yeah, yeah, I think that fructose, is really the key to the whole thing. It's the molecule sucrose is sugar, the sweet
Yeah,
white stuff.
yeah.
So regular, what we call blood sugar, our glucose is only
Glucose,
glucose, but sucrose is one half glucose and one half fructose.
fructose.
And the fructose seems to be the most damaging part. It's possible that, a population that eats only glucose, but doesn't have fructose in the diet, doesn't, have that extra part of it, will be more or less metabolically healthy. And maybe that's, for most of history, maybe that's how India was. That's certainly, you see populations in the historical record that do eat a lot of carbohydrates, but seem to do relatively well. But once sugar comes into the diet, that seems to be a turning point, because once the sugar comes in, then you start to see all these metabolic effects that we talk about. You start to see the elevated triglycerides, you start to see the additional fat, particularly the visceral fat around the organs, and that seems to drive this insulin resistance. And I see it all as the same thing. Diabetes, insulin resistance, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and many of these cancers I see as all one kind of connected phenomenon. And I think that unfortunately, to reverse it, you can't just cut out the fructose. Once you have it, and most of us do have it, I certainly did have it at one point. I hope I don't anymore. But then you have to cut back more carbohydrates than just sugar to reverse it. But the good news is that it is, for most people, it is reversible. And, that's one of the most important messages to get out.
Very, very, very interesting. So in your research, do you think the anti-cancer drugs also targets somewhere this glucose metabolism? Are there drugs which affects the glucose metabolism, which the cancer cells do?
Yeah, well, there's sort of two ways that I think about this. There's, what this story tells us about prevention and what this story tells us about treatment.
Treatment.
I think the more important story in a way is about prevention, but I am optimistic, that it'll lead to some important treatments as well. Right now, there are early signs, and there's a few specific metabolic treatments that have been successful, but it's still early in the process. But what we've seen is that, we know, I think fairly certainly, that this hyperinsulinemia drives cancer. And so the question, if you could block the insulin receptor, if you could block this PI3K pathway, will that make a difference? And the initial trials, have been somewhat disappointing in that respect. And the question is why. And one hypothesis is that the problem is that, if you block the insulin receptor, then, you're basically creating more insulin resistance. The pancreas responds by putting out more insulin, and then you're sort of not getting the effect that you want. And so what's been really interesting in recent years is to see the combination of ketogenic diets together with metabolic drugs, and then you're keeping the insulin low through diet and also getting the extra effect of blocking these pathways. And these trials are ongoing, but I think they're going to be, not for every cancer, but, I'm very optimistic. And in addition to that, there's new trials going on with specific diets. Some cancers might be identified to have a mutation that relies more on glutamine or another nutrient source. And, having, in the same way we've talked about targeted drugs, the future might be targeted diets. But I think more often than not, the diet is going to end up being the ketogenic diet or some form of that, just because that's kind of the starting point. And, I think it remains to be seen, but, my hope is that, even if the therapies don't work out, that we won't forget about the prevention, because, the prevention is a huge part of this.
Very, very interesting. So we hope that, in future they will do that. And of late, we have been seeing quite a number of studies which says that ketogenic diet is able to at least prevent the progression, in some cases to be very, very, very effective. We have known some people who have kept the cancer progression rather under remission on a very strong ketogenic diet. No doubt some people do succumb to it in spite of being on that. There was also
Yeah.
a study which has just appeared a couple of months back, which is linking hyperinsulinemia again to cancer. So I think that was just released maybe in December also. So a lot of
Yeah.
such studies, a lot of such case papers are coming. And then a lot of anecdotes, of course, we always see people claiming in social media. Of course, most of the
Yeah.
cancer cell, while they drink glucose, there are some who are known to, of course, generate energy through other sources, as you said, maybe glutamine or even fatty acids. Yes, so very few cancer cell also do
Yeah.
generate energy out of fatty acid. So it is not very exclusively glucose, but then very, very interesting. And
Yeah.
some of the interesting data we have even on India. I don't know, maybe you must be already knowing, but nevertheless, I thought I'll just mention, as per the ICMR study recently, 1 in 9 in India are at risk for developing cancer. 1 in 9. And
Yeah.
some of the top cancers which we have, as per various studies, are lung cancer, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, maybe even esophageal cancer. So, so, so it's really rising like anything in India. In fact, the mortality is also rising each year. In fact, incidences, and if we compare, there is a data which is showing the incidence of diabetes as well as mortality 2020, 2021, and 2022. It is just increasing exponentially, and they predict that by 2025, again, it will be really a disastrous outlook which we have. And
Yeah. That's
yeah,
so it's so tragic in a sense because we're seeing, the same pattern that we saw in other places.
yeah.
Now we're seeing it, play out in India and China and other countries. It's like watching a horror movie a second time in slow motion. And it's very frustrating because, I think there's so much more we can do in prevention. As you said, cancer cells, once you have cancer, the diet doesn't always work, partially because these cancer cells, they're like, it's like a return to the wild. They're very good at evolving, learning new ways to eat. It's hard to cut them off of nutrients once, but if you never get to that point, if you can focus more on prevention, that's really the key. And again, you're not going to prevent every cancer, but it's just a reasonable thing to keep insulin low. If you think of it as high insulin as a carcinogen, imagine if there were similar studies based on some chemical in the environment. Everybody, there would be a national movement to get rid of that chemical, but because the chemical turns out to be a natural one, it's in our own bodies, and we have to recognize that that's what we want to keep low, and that the foods we eat drive that process.
And no wonder, like uh, even metformin is said to be having anti-cancer properties. In fact, there are many people who take metformin prophylactically, maybe as an anti-aging, anti-cancer also. So somewhere that insulin resistance part is always coming in. So again, very interesting. And as you mentioned earlier, that yeah, Germany was one of the leading place for science. In fact, uh, uh, I spent 35 years in pharmaceutical sales, and I know that and I was working for a German company, so I know that they were one of the leading innovators in pharmaceutical medicine long back, and coincidentally in this diabetes space, Germans were the first one to discover sulfonylurea class of drugs
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
diabetes. And
Yeah.
probably after World War II, everything just disintegrated, and they no more remain one of the big scientific hubs, been taken over by the other countries. Very interesting. So
Yeah.
yeah, now the situation in India is like now primarily for centuries we were a land of famine.
Yeah.
And we are not used to eating caloric dense food, and uh, so suddenly we now have we are in influx of refined foods, refined flour, refined carbohydrate, lot of sugars,
Yeah.
and probably even there is a hypothesis that excess usage of this refined vegetable oils can cause cancer, the pollution, the pesticide usage. So I think everything is really implicated in this, and I think we are in a very serious situation. And
Yeah.
what my message is also like, whatever we see, we should be able to take care of our health to some extent, in the sense that now we know that there is glucose involved, we know that there is insulin involved. So our objective has to be on a lower glucose diet, which will in turn have a little lower insulin secretion with us. So Sam, very interesting. Um, uh, what
I was
message would you? Yeah, yeah,
I was just going to say that I personally, I feel, that I have something in common with a lot of Indian people, and that, one of the things that's been noticed, I think, is that, the process is in terms of developing these metabolic issues. The process would be that you eat a lot of sugar, that you start to develop, your body starts to store more fat. But it's very interesting, from population to population, individual to individual, people store fat differently. Some people, actually store extra calories, extra fat subcutaneously under the skin, and they can be a little overweight, but still not develop diabetes and insulin resistance. But in my family, my grandfather died of diabetes, my father was pre-diabetic, and they were both relatively skinny. I started to get high triglycerides, even though people thought I was skinny, because I think, like a lot of people in India, like, I didn't store fat well under my skin. It went right to the liver. And so people, I think, don't understand that it's not about being fat, at least appearing fat. It's really about how your body stores it. And you shouldn't assume that you're in good metabolic shape just because, you don't appear to be overweight.
yeah. I think the best measure is to see the waist size. If we have, I think Indian phenotype is, we are all lean, having central obesity or tummy fat. So I
Yeah,
think
no, but that's exactly what I was.
I think we should realize that, you see, I have seen certain very obese individuals not having fatty liver, whereas thin, lean guys will have fatty liver.
Yeah, yeah,
I have actually seen a couple of reports, lab reports. So that is
yeah,
how it works. I mean, the moment you have central obesity, you have a pot belly, you are having liver fat, and there is visceral fat which is present, and which is going to cause, or it is a vicious cycle of insulin resistance, of course. Very, very,
yeah,
very interesting. So Sam,
yeah. And
yeah, Sam.
no, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, what is your message for India?
Well, I guess, my message, is partially what I just said, that don't assume that you're metabolically healthy just because, you don't appear to be overweight. I can tell you from my personal experience, I thought that I was thin, and then, I had very elevated triglycerides, and I was eating a very poor diet. So that's part of it. The other part, of course, and this is, a message for everybody, is that don't assume that if your glucose looks relatively normal, that you're metabolically healthy, because unfortunately, it takes decades for these problems sometimes to show up. For many decades, your pancreas might be overproducing insulin, and it's doing its job. It's overcoming the insulin resistance. It's keeping the glucose down. But meanwhile, your body, still has that insulin flowing through it, and it has many, negative effects. So you can't rely just on the blood glucose readings. One early sign is often high triglycerides or low HDL. But you can also, of course, test your insulin. More doctors, I hope, will begin to do that. And then the other thing is, you mentioned that these low carbohydrate or low sugar diets are important. It doesn't, many people do it with the meat-based diet, but it doesn't have to be. If you're a vegetarian, you can still eat a very healthy diet. Maybe a little more challenging, but it's certainly doable. And I think that everybody should do it in the way that they're able to, that meets their own personal standards and obligations. But the goal, in one way or another, I think, should be to keep the insulin low.
Yeah, fine. Thanks, Sam. There are few questions I'd like to take up here. Susan
Sure.
is asking, is fruit bad because of fructose?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I would say that, if you are insulin resistant and you're trying to reverse it, then I wouldn't eat very much fruit because, it does, if you're certainly like eat watermelon, if you eat grapes, you eat bananas, these are very kind of low fiber, sugary fruits. You'll see, if you wear a continuous glucose monitor, just take a bite, you'll see the glucose shoot up. So I would say that if you're metabolically healthy and, you might be able to afford some fruit, certainly berries are lower in glucose, but if you're trying to cut back and to lose weight, I would probably cut most fruit as well. And that comes from my last name is Apple, so it's ironic that I'm against fruit, but I think I have to be for most part.
So Sam, would you know through your research which cancers respond most to low carb keto diet? So this is again a question. So
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean the ones that, in terms of treatment, actually, the interestingly, certain brain tumors that are very highly glycolytic, take up a lot of glucose, have responded well. But in generally speaking, in terms of prevention, I think, the obvious ones to look at are the ones that, are most closely connected to obesity and insulin resistance. So pancreatic cancer for prevention. I had one doctor, pancreatic cancer specialist, who said to me that it basically is diabetes, that, if you want to prevent pancreatic cancer, you have to try to keep your insulin low. And then, other ones that are famously, connected to diet are, all the ones that are really, tend to be the most common: breast cancer, colon cancer, colorectal cancer, kidney cancer. They tend to be, among the most common and most deadly cancers that are connected to obesity and insulin resistance. So, yeah, I mean, it's just a good strategy across the board.
does low carb diet help during chemotherapy? Also, does fasting help treat cancer or during chemo?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I should periodically point out that that I'm a journalist, not a doctor, and I don't, when someone is doing chemotherapy, personally, it's such a very difficult thing. Some people might be losing too much weight. I think it's really a case by case basis, what a doctor advises. But that said, I think that, once somebody is in a stable place, I think, it only makes sense if you have, one of these 13 cancers that's related to insulin resistance and obesity. I think it's more than 13, but that's the 13 is the official number now. In the US, that's over 600,000 cancer diagnoses a year. If you have one of these cancers and you can, you're healthy enough to do it, I would certainly think it makes sense to, after you get or before, during, or after your treatment, to then move on to a low carbohydrate diet. For some people, that might mean also doing, some kind of intermittent fasting as well. And you can think of it as an adjuvant therapy. I don't think people should not take the other cancer drugs. They should get the chemotherapy. But then, once you get that chemotherapy, once you hopefully cure your cancer, then you want to stay as metabolically healthy as possible to increase your odds of it not coming back. So I do think that, if I'm diagnosed with cancer and it's one of these type of cancers, I think I'll certainly try to do it myself.
Thanks. Thank you. There's a question here. Is there any link between cancer and stress, emotional pressure, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, there are studies that say that. I'm personally a little bit skeptical of that. One of the things that makes cancer so hard is that you can't do the type of studies that you would want to do with nutrition. In a perfect world, we do a study where you give everybody sugar in one group and nobody sugar in the other group, and you'd follow them for 20 years, and then you'd get a really conclusive, sign. So we can't really do the studies we want in cancer. So we have to look for these correlations, the correlation between insulin and cancer, glucose and cancer. And these can be very, tricky. Some correlations are stronger than others, but a correlation never, shows true causation. So what I've looked at is correlations connected to what we understand about goes on in the cancer cell, the combination of a mechanistic understanding, and does that fit with the correlation with the stress stuff. I don't think we have a good understanding of the mechanisms. It is certainly true that, if you don't sleep enough, if you don't, treat your body well, that can contribute to insulin resistance. So that could be one pathway, but I don't think there's enough evidence with respect to stress. Plus, you can get stressed thinking about that. So that could be, if there is a problem, thinking about it too much could be even worse.
There's something interesting I wanted to share. There's a train which leaves from Bathinda, Punjab, and reaches Rajasthan, Bikaner, and the train is known as cancer train, because there's a big cancer hospital in Bikaner, in a state called Rajasthan, and there's a train which leaves from a state called Punjab. So probably because of the agricultural practices of using a lot of pesticides, most of the families there are affected. The farmers are affected with cancer, and that whole many of the people, they travel in that train to this hospital, and the train has been dubbed or renamed as cancer train.
Wow,
Very
that's really interesting.
very
Yeah.
interesting, very unfortunate.
Yeah, and that's really what Otto Warburg believed, that it was chemicals, pesticides that interfere with the respiration.
Yeah.
I do think that's true in some cancers. I think that, a lot of times people are so focused on these chemicals in the environment, they forget about, the sugar and the insulin, but it doesn't mean that those can also be a part of the problem as well.
I think there is everything is at play. Probably the pesticides, the chemical, the hyperinsulinemic factor, the sugar, glucose, fructose, everything could be at play probably, and probably exacerbates this. So it's everything at play. And sometimes, what I say, the first question was fruits. So what I say is, modern fruits are grown with pesticide, and it is chemically ripened and hybridized to be high in sugar. So this is what modern fruits are: pesticide laden, chemically ripened, and hybridized to be high in sugar. So I think it's really a combo. I mean, if we have any of the ordinary fruit, is really could be a bomb if we have it in excess, what I say. So source some good organic low sugar fruit is what I say, tell people, instead of gorging on bananas. So in India, most of the bananas are now chemically ripened. They use some chemical to ripen it, and it is very high in sugar also compared to the older version. So it could be bomb, possibly.
Yeah, and it could be, the interplay, like, if you look at smoking and lung cancer, obviously smoking has played an important role, but insulin resistance also appears to play a role. So it could be, these combination of the two things, that if you have insulin resistance, it sort of makes you more vulnerable, and then the second carcinogen comes in and actually drives the effect. It's hard to untangle these things.
So there's a question from Mr. Dharmendra: can cancer be completely reversed like type 2 diabetes through low carb diet?
I don't think so. I mean, again, there been some cancers, there's some incredible stories, particularly with specific brain cancers where people have completely reversed it. But, I don't, and there are some stories of people going on very low calorie diets. I think of these things as, occasionally there are incredible stories, but it makes more sense to think of it as an adjuvant therapy, that you do this together with other treatments. And diet alone, I don't think is going to cure most cancers, unfortunately. So diabetes, is really kind of a different case in this respect. But, I hope that doesn't prevent people from focusing on prevention and maintaining metabolic health once you have cancer and once you have other therapies.
Very interesting. And there are a lot of anecdotes. For example, we know that Nasha Winters, so she has written a book called The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. And many of us may not know that when she was small, she was sent home to telling that she has cancer and nothing can be done. And she came home, and then she followed ketogenic diet, and then till today everything is under remission. She says she is cured or under remission, and then she has written a book called The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. So very interesting,
Yeah.
and we have a lot of such anecdotes with us.
Yeah, no, there are a lot of intriguing anecdotes, and I think that's important. But I also think it's important that what I don't want is that the ketogenic diet or the metabolic approach to treating cancer will be treated by the medical world as quackery. I want to take it seriously, and so I don't want to make extreme claims because the medical world doesn't want to listen to anything about diet, and the moment anything is made too extreme, I think we have to follow the science. We've complained about all the claims that were made for low-fat diets because they didn't follow the science. Like, I don't want to repeat the mistakes of the others. Let's, go slow, follow the science, but not be afraid to follow the science, even if it, contradicts our beliefs.
Very much, very much. Yeah. Any more questions? Anyone wants to ask any question? They can unmute and ask if they want. Nick, thanks for sharing that link. Thank you very much, Nick.
I think you might be muted.
Nick, no, he's unmuted. I think it's not reaching us. Fine. Fine. Anyone wants to ask any question? Anyone else? Fine. So we'll wind up. So Sam, thank you very much for accepting this invitation, coming to India virtually on a Sunday morning, though it is evening here, and sharing something about your finding and your book. Of course, though it was launched almost 2 years back, nevertheless, it still remains relevant. And I hope people from India will go ahead and please read Sam's book. Very, very interesting, and it will throw some light, and it will at least set you on the path of a healthy living. So Sam, thank you very much for accepting this invite.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was honored to be here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So I'm stopping the recording time.